Hello, this is part 3 of the explanatory failure of Benatar's asymmetry. David Benatar has put forth an argument for anti-natalism which proposes that there is an asymmetry between pleasure and pain for those who never exist. He says that the absence of pleasure is not bad, but the absence of pain is good for those who never exist. This would be symmetrical if we said that the absence of pain is good and the absence of pleasure is bad, or it would be symmetrical if we said that the absence of pain is not good and the absence of pleasure is not bad. But by saying that the absence of pain is good and the absence of pleasure is not bad, there's an asymmetry here. And according to Benatar, this asymmetry implies that it's always a harm to come into existence. I presented his main argument for this in my video, The Double Standard Behind Benatar's Asymmetry Argument for Anti-Natalism. And my main criticism of it in that video was that it is based on a double standard. Now, after he makes his main argument for this asymmetry, he claims that this asymmetry is the best explanation for 4 other asymmetries. And in the previous 2 videos, Part 1 and Part 2 of the explanatory failure of Benatar's asymmetry, I go over the first and second asymmetries that he discusses, and I explain why his asymmetry is not a good explanation for them. Now, in this video, I'm going to cover the last 2 asymmetries that he brings up, and explain once again why his asymmetry is not a good explanation for them. Let's now look at the third asymmetry that Benatar has brought up here. He says, bringing people into existence as well as failing to bring people into existence can be regretted. However, only bringing people into existence can be regretted for the sake of the person whose existence was contingent on our decision. Well, if he were saying that only bringing people into existence can be regretted, whereas failing to bring people into existence cannot be regretted, which itself would be a very ridiculous thing to say, then his asymmetry could play some explanatory role in explaining why that would be true. But what he does say here can be explained without his asymmetry. And it's just saying only bringing people into existence can be regretted for the sake of the person whose existence was contingent on our decision. So in the case where someone actually exists, we can regret something for the sake of that person. But in the case where someone does not exist, we cannot regret something for the sake of that person who does not exist. And this is in fact the explanation that Benatar gives to this himself. He says it's not that the never existent person is indeterminate, such that we don't know who the never existent person was, but simply that the never existent person does not exist. And that's the main reason we cannot regret anything concerning the person who does not exist. He says we can regret for the sake of an indeterminate but existent person that a benefit was not bestowed on him or her, but we cannot regret for the sake of somebody who never exists and thus cannot thereby be deprived a good that this never existent person never experiences. And I agree with this explanation, but I want to point out that this explanation does not involve his asymmetry between 3 and 4. And I could just as easily say this: we can be glad for the sake of an indeterminate but existent person that a benefit was bestowed on him or her, but we cannot be glad for the sake of somebody who never exists and thus cannot thereby be benefited that this person fails to experience some harm. And this has the same explanation as the asymmetry he brought up, except it's reversing things, so that it's talking about benefits to people and being glad about them instead of regretting harms to people. Further along in this explanation for this asymmetry, he says, the reason why we do not lament our failure to bring somebody into existence is because absent pleasures are not bad. Let me point out first of all that this claim that we do not lament our failure to bring somebody into existence could be a contradiction of what he previously said in describing this asymmetry, where he said, bringing people into existence, as well as failing to bring people into existence, can be regretted. So he must mean something different by lament than he means by regret. And let me turn back to this and point out that this is all he's saying here is absent pleasures are not bad. He's not saying it's because absent pleasures are not bad, but absent pains are good. He's just saying absent pleasures are not bad. And this refers only to number 4 in his asymmetry. It does not refer to part 3. So referring to just one part of the asymmetry is not a way of using that asymmetry to explain something. It's not the asymmetry between 3 and 4 that's explaining anything here. It's simply 4 all alone by itself that has any explanatory power here. And 4 all alone by itself is compatible with the position that I maintained in my double standard video, that the absence of pain is actually not good, that the absence of pain and the absence of pleasure both have 0 value. This position is completely consistent with the explanation that Benatar has given for this asymmetry here. Therefore, it's not the asymmetry that is explaining this, it's simply 4 alone. Let's now turn to the 4th asymmetry that Benatar brings up. It goes like this. Whereas at least when we think of them, we rightly are sad for inhabitants of a foreign land whose lives are characterized by suffering, when we hear that some island is unpopulated, we are not similarly sad for the happy people who, had they existed, would have populated this island. Similarly, nobody really mourns for those who do not exist on Mars, feeling sorry for potential such beings that they cannot enjoy life. Yet if we knew that there were sentient life on Mars, but that Martians were suffering, we would regret this for them. This asymmetry is a variation on the third one, which we just went over. And both of them are talking about how we can feel something negative concerning the suffering of people who actually do exist, but we don't feel something similar concerning the absence of pleasure for people who do not exist. And the same explanation works for both of these. The third one could be explained by saying that we can feel something only for people who do exist and not for people who do not exist. And that same explanation works for this 4th asymmetry here. We can feel something for people who actually do exist. And we cannot feel something for people who do not actually exist. And also the same objection that I brought up to the 3rd can be made to the 4th. And remember, this is not an objection to saying that the explanation doesn't work. It's just an objection to saying that the asymmetry between 3 and 4 plays any part in that explanation. In discussing the 4th asymmetry, Benatar brings up an objection similar to the one I've already brought up while discussing the 3rd. And it goes like this. Now it might be objected that just as we do not regret the absent pleasures of those who could have existed, we do not take joy in the absent pain of those who could have existed. And his response to this is to say that joy is not the appropriate contrast to regret. And we can agree with this. Joy is a very strong emotion. Regret can be a milder emotion. But let's compare this to what he said in his original formulation of the asymmetry. We're going to look at the Martian version of this asymmetry, where he talks about regret. And he contrasts regret here with mourning. Well, if he uses mourning in one part of the asymmetry and regret in the other, then the asymmetry itself could be attributed to the difference between mourning and regret. They're very different from each other. I can feel regret over losing my bookmark in a book, but I mourn the death of my father. Very different emotions there. So if mourning and regret are really not on the same level here, we should not be using them in the same asymmetry. We should reformulate the asymmetry to use the same term in both parts. And since Benatar wants to talk about regret. We'll reframe it in terms of regret. So it can go like this. Nobody really feels regret for those who do not exist on Mars. Yet if we knew that there were sentient life on Mars, but that Martians were suffering, we would regret this for them. And to better understand what he could mean by this, let's look at what he contrasts regret with instead of joy. He contrasts regret with what we might call welcome or simply good. But I think that welcome and simply good are not actually synonyms of each other. To call something simply good is to say that it adds positive value to the world. But something could be welcome simply for relieving suffering, for example. For example, the relief of pain could be welcome. Even though it doesn't add anything positive to the world, it's just decreasing what's negative, it could still be welcome. And likewise, something could be unwelcome because it decreases something that's good. I might consider the absence of pleasure that follows death to be an unwelcome facet of being dead. So let's look at each formulation of this asymmetry here. First of all, we could say nobody really feels that non-existent Martians have it bad, which is true because they don't exist. Yet if we knew that there were sentient life on Mars, but that Martians were suffering, we would consider this bad for them. And true again, if they were suffering, that would be bad for them. And this simply depends on the difference between what we can say about those who actually do exist and those who don't exist. And the other version goes like this. Nobody really considers it an unwelcome condition of non-existence that never existent Martians feel no pleasure. Yet if we knew that there were sentient life on Mars, but that Martians were suffering, we would consider this unwelcome for them. And true enough, we would consider it unwelcome for them. However, I think that non-existence is an unwelcome condition of never existing. I also think that not feeling pleasure is an unwelcome condition of non-existence. So I disagree with the first part of this asymmetry, and so I actually disagree with this version of the asymmetry. And so as we look at the various versions of the asymmetry here, either they're false, like this one appears to be, or they can be easily explained because of the difference between what we can say about the existing and what we can say about the not existing, and they in no way depend upon an asymmetry between 3 and 4. The explanations that can be given for them are perfectly compatible with the position that both the absence of pleasure and the absence of pain have zero value for the never existent. And as we've looked at all 4 of the asymmetries that Benatar has brought up, we've found out that in each case, his asymmetry between 3 and 4 plays absolutely no role in explaining them. So in each case, he has failed to show that his asymmetry between 3 and 4 explains the asymmetries he has brought up. So none of this counts as evidence for his asymmetry between 3 and 4. And let me point out that there is a text version of the same material I went over in this video on my blog. It's not a word-for-word transcript because I did not read from it as I was making this video. And it will cover some things in different ways than this video did. And it may hit some points that the video didn't hit. So here it is. I'll just scroll down so you can read it in the video if it ever disappears from the web. And let me point out that right now I'm showing the blog in a narrower format such that this is the way it would look on your phone pretty much. There will be some differences since this is still on a desktop. But it uses a responsive theme. I've set it up so that if you expand it, it's going to show you things in a serif font. But when you bring it back down to a narrow screen, it's sans serif again. So it gives you your choice of reading serif or sans serif. at least on a desktop. On a phone, it's going to be sans serif. So check out the blog. There are also other articles on the blog that I've never made videos on. And think of subscribing to this channel, which is For the Love of Wisdom. If you've liked this video, don't forget to favorite it or share it or like it down below. One of the central notions of Christianity is the idea of original sin. It's expressed in Romans 5:12, which says, "Sin entered the world through one man, and death through sin. And in this way death came to all people, because all sinned." And this verse is referring back to the story of Adam and Eve, where they each ate of the fruit of the tree of knowledge of good and evil, thus acquiring knowledge of good and evil, which made them sinners. And once they became sinners, they were cast out of the Garden of Eden, and their descendants were all tainted with original sin. And it's because their descendants were tainted with original sin that everyone is now deserving of burning in hell forever, according to Christianity. And it is through the atonement of Jesus Christ dying on the cross that we may receive the grace of God and go to heaven. And so this notion of original sin is central to the Christianity as is commonly taught. Now, one response to this is just to say that the Adam and Eve story is a myth that never happened, because in fact evolution is true and the creation myth of the Bible just didn't happen. And so we are not tainted with original sin, and we may discard all of Christianity because of that. And that's not the direction I want to go in this video. That may be a legitimate view, but I think that the story of Adam and Eve has something important to tell us. And I want to look at the notion of original sin not from an evolution versus creationism perspective, but from a moral perspective. Hello, I'm Dr. Fergus Donahoe, and you're watching For the Love of Wisdom. Contrary to what I've said in a previous satirical video, I have never been a member of a cult. But in this video, we're going to be looking at the question, what is a cult? And I'm going to begin by going over some misconceptions about what makes something a cult. One misconception of a cult is the idea that a cult is just a false religion.